This panel was inspired by the exhibition of wonderful drawings of Boston City Hall, which are on view outside and which you'll all have an opportunity to view later on. Historic New England is proud to be the long-term stewards of these magnificent works, and we are so happy to be making them accessible to a broad audience. We are committed to preserving the built environment of New England from the 17th century to the present, and our collection of architectural drawings numbers in the thousands and represents the work of more than 400 architects and builders practicing from the 17th century to the present time. We continue to seek out and actively collect the work of contemporary architects. We are delighted to be partnering with the BSA this evening on the exhibition and on this panel discussion. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our illustrious panel participants. Michael McKinnell is the architect who, along with Gerhard Kallmann and Edward Knowles, won the design competition for Boston City Hall. A principal at Kallmann McKinnell and Wood for nearly half a century, Michael was also a longtime faculty member at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. In 2005, he was appointed to the United States Commission of Fine Arts. This occasion honors Michael and his late partner, Gerhard Kallmann, whose tremendous vision and work are on view here for all of us to appreciate and to admire. Robert Campbell, an architect, author, and poet. Robert has written about architecture and urban design for decades, for publications including Architectural Record and the Boston Globe. For his criticism for the Globe, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. He has taught extensively and was also an advisor for the National Mayor's Institute on City Design, which he helped establish. Peter Eisenman is the founding principal of Eisenman Architects in New York. Over the decades, he has published numerous books and articles. He was the founder and director of the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies in New York, and is currently the professor of professional practice at the Yale School of Architecture. His connections with Michael McKinnell and Gerhard Kallmann date back to the 1950s. Alex Krieger is an architect and a principal at the architecture and planning firm of NBBJ. He has taught at Harvard's Graduate School of Design since 1977. Alex edited the first book on Kallmann McKinnell and Wood in 1988, which accompanied an exhibition of the firm's drawings at the GSD. Among other recognition, he currently serves as a member of the United States Commission on Fine Arts. Elizabeth Padjen is an architect who has also been an editor and a writer for a number of publications, including the journal Architecture. With this experience, she founded and was the longtime editor of Architecture Boston, widely regarded as one of the best and most thoughtful publications on architecture. She formerly served as the president of the Boston Society of Architects. Gary Wolf. Gary is the principal of Wolf Architects in Boston, and over the years he has also written on architecture for a variety of publications, including the Architectural Review and Boston Review. He is the vice president of the New England chapter of Docomomo. In 2007, Gary organized the first exhibition of historic New England's Boston City Hall drawings, now expanded here at the BSA. I extend Historic New England's and the BSA's deep appreciation to Gary. Gary has worked tirelessly on this exhibition and on this panel discussion this evening. His extensive knowledge of and enthusiasm for Boston City Hall are apparent to all of us here this evening. I just want to point out that we do have copies available for all of you this is Gary's article about the City Hall drawings, which appeared in Historic New England's magazine. They're on the table over there. If there aren't enough to go around, just send us an email and we'll be happy to send you one. So without further ado, Gary.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you all for coming, and I understand that if you haven't seen the exhibit, it will be open for a brief while after our discussion, so you can have a chance to go through at that point in time. For a generation after the competition for Boston City Hall, the promise of City Hall and the design itself attracted many people to the city. Many of you are aware of this because of your age, but others may not be aware of this. Aside from the fact that in a typical guidebook such as Michelin New England, the City Hall is a 2-star attraction rated at the same level as Beacon Hill or Faneuil Hall. The excitement of the new plans for City Hall and for Boston really drew a large number of young professionals to the city. I'm sure there are people here who came because of that. For those people, the idea of a new Boston, an exciting, rejuvenated, historic city, really made a difference. Today, younger people may come to Boston and see City Hall and kind of wonder, well, what's this all about? What's this meaning? Why is this building here? One would hope that a mayor or a mayoral candidate who has the same questions might realize that there's a Boston Landmarks Commission in City Hall and that he can go there and he can find out from paid professional staff whose job it is to identify and protect historic buildings in the city of Boston, that in fact they can provide information to him about the value of City Hall as well. However, for people who are not familiar with this, who weren't perhaps aware that as early as 1991, the Massachusetts Historical Commission declared that City Hall was eligible for the National Register of Historic National Register of Historic Places and the protection that that provides. The drawings in the next room help understand a little bit about the genesis of this building. We're hoping that tonight in our panel discussion we'll be able to discuss more about that to help understand what this building is, what the impact was, what the firm was that came out of the competition, and understand something of their impact, not just in Boston, but beyond. What I'd like to do is talk about the competition as the context for the drawings, the reason they were created, discuss the drawings themselves, the design of City Hall, and then attend to the firm KMW and some of the work that subsequently was produced, so that we can see these drawings as having an impact on the future direction, not just of the city of Boston, but architecture in America, and a firm that's widely regarded as one of the significant firms of the latter half of the 20th century. Sorry. There may be people who had difficulty determining a couple of those buildings, which century they were from, but there's a reason for it. Alex, perhaps to get us started, you've written about past futures, about the sometimes grandiose plans that preceded Government Center, as we know it now, preceded City Hall, plans dating back to the early part of the 19th century for yes, rejuvenating of the city. And since the idea of a design competition really evolved out of this interest in creating a new city, maybe a bit of background before we get into the content of the drawings might be valuable.
I'm not sure I expected that question in particular, but let me say that many of you may be reading about Detroit at the moment and about how sad it is, and it's in bankruptcy, and it's lost half of its population or more over the past 50 years, and on and on and on. And somehow people assume this is the result of the recession of a couple of years ago, as opposed to having begun in the 1950s. Boston was the Detroit of the 1950s. Boston was a dying town. It had lost 30% of its population between 1930 and 1950 or so. It lost 25% of its taxable base. We were about to shut the door on Boston, and many people believed it was never going to recover. And this is, such a, we've forgotten this. Well, most of us weren't even around at the time, but it was true. And so the renaissance that Boston has made is astonishing. We hope that Detroit does half as well over the next decade or two or three. And actually, there are many reasons for the revival of Boston, but not least of which actually was this competition, was the announcement of a government center urban renewal program, was the announcement that the kind of cradle of liberty was going to once more be the cradle of liberty and host the three edifices for the three branches of American government. And indeed, that was not maybe the very first part of the revival, but a very significant early part of the turnaround that Boston has experienced. So we kind of forget what a momentous time it was when, not when the competition was announced, when the winner was announced, and the idea that this was going to be built began to be believed in Boston. And so the idea of a new Boston, which we talk about a lot now, meant actually a lot more back in the 1960s, because we were ready for a new Boston, having been involved in a kind of a dying Boston ever since really the Depression, and even earlier than that. And so it's hard for us to appreciate with what sort of joy, in a sense, this notion of a new city, a new center, a new city hall, which had been discussed for 30 or 40 years prior to that. Various other proposals had been made. Finally, it was going to come, and it was going to represent the future of the city, not so much its past. And I may, I'll stop at this point, but I wanted to kind of, in a sense, make you feel what a momentous time it was in Boston, and how important this particular symbol was to the resurgence of Boston that began and continues to this point as well. I almost thought to bring what I call a centerfold. Now, it was a centerfold, literally. It was the center of a New York Times Sunday supplement, paid for by the Boston Chamber of Commerce. It was a 2-page spread, the center of which was the demolition of Scully Square. Right next to it was an image of the competition, and a story about how, hey, the captains of the universe, masters of the universe, all you folks out there, come back. Look at how we're preparing the city for its future. And so I'll stop at that point, but it was not just a building. As magnificent as the building was the expectation that it kind of was indeed going to be a significant act in the resurgence of Boston, overcoming 30, 40 years or so of economic decline.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment here?
Well, I'll just jump in, because I think the Detroit analogy...
Is that on, or is that off?
I turned it off, sorry.
I think the Detroit analogy is a fabulous one, and it's very interesting to think about Detroit having in its way tried to save itself in the past with another building, which was the Renaissance Center, which of course did nothing of the kind. So it's a very interesting question, say, what can architecture do for a city when you have a massive investment of public money? It can only go so far. You need to pull people around it, and that's what this project did in its time. It was handled in a way that put a signal out that the process was clean in a city where there were all kinds of allegations of corruption and cronyism and lots of backroom dealings. That was a big deal. But the fact that the whole community came together around this project was significant, because it built a momentum that allowed the city to go beyond just this building to take it to the next step. which is sort of a critical aspect of any kind of community building, is to get buy-in from everyone. And somehow that managed to happen in this place, maybe because everyone was so desperate, I'm not sure, but also because there were a few signature people, business leaders who were in position that time, Bob Morgan from the Boston Five, among others, labor leaders, community people, and that made a huge difference.
Can I just add one more thing? I mean, without taking anything away from City Hall, it was the idea of building it was the idea of the government center, not so much just only City Hall. Now, however, if you're going to like print a symbol of the government center, you were going to print the JFK building. So of course, the most spectacular part of the government center urban renewal was of course City Hall, but the excitement was about rebuilding the center of the city on behalf of displaying its civic functions, local, state, and actually federal.
I agree with some of that, and some of that I don't. When I was an undergraduate here in, believe it or not, the 1950s, I've just been told by Peter Eisenman that have I reached 60 yet, so I'm happy about that. Nobody in my class was going to stay in Boston. You had to be completely lacking in ambition if you were going to stay in Boston. You go to New York, you go to California, you go to Chicago, you go anywhere. It was a dead city in that sense. Where I disagree a little bit is I don't see how you can make a cause and effect relationship between Boston City Hall and the redevelopment of Boston. A lot of other cities have redeveloped themselves during the same period without building a city hall. And I think the Faneuil Hall Marketplace, which came along about 10 years after City Hall, probably had also an equal sort of power over it. But you're absolutely right about that period of optimism. The cities were dying because everybody had run off to the suburbs, and the kinds of industries that had manufacturing, for example, in Detroit, and textiles and things like that in Boston and many others, they seemed to be dying. And so that it was sort of, it reminds me of the time after the fire of London in 1666, whatever it was. A wonderful time for architects. The city had burned down. It needed everything. And that was exactly the feeling, a combination of optimism and a kind of scared quality.
I'm here for nostalgia reasons. I remember Boston when James Michael Curley was the mayor, and we used to go to Scully Square, and were sort of upset when it was torn down. So I don't think this is on. Maybe it is.
Yes, sir.
It is, okay. I think more than anybody other than Michael on this panel, I was most affected by Michael's winning. And I think it's important to get that out on the table. Michael and I had been at graduate school together in 1959, and Michael, for some reason, decided to send me off to England. For whatever reason, I don't know. We didn't know about the competition at the time. But we had decided we were going to practice together when I returned from my year in England, which would have been around 1961. I enjoyed England so much I decided to stay, and in the fall of 61, when I was supposed to return and become a partner with Michael, I was still staying in England. And the competition came up. I never had these feelings about Boston, that good, bad, or indifferent, even though I'm a Red Sox fan from 1940. No, I was not a Dodger fan. No, I wasn't a Dodger fan. And I'm not a Jets fan either, so even... we in England decided to do the competition. I worked with, as Michael worked with one of his teachers, I worked with one of my teachers, Colin Rowe, and we did a submission for the competition. And that was fine that we didn't win, and we knew that Michael was a finalist, and I was hoping like hell that he wasn't going to win. I have to be as honest as that. And of course, when the news came, I was in deep shock. Not that Michael and I would have ever gone into practice, but Going into practice with Gary Kallmann, that was another thing. So I stayed in England for a while, but I have to say that looking back on it, I think it was an amazing, number one, an amazing achievement. Forget whether it's a Boston or not. It did something for architecture in the United States, which is what I'm interested in. It couldn't be done today. The competition wouldn't be held today. The jury would not pick that building today, which tells you something about this world, and it wouldn't be built today. And I think it's an incredible achievement that Boston has that building. I always marvel at the scale of it, its being in the city, and what it has done, as far as I'm concerned, for me when I'm in Boston. And so I think that for architecture and for my friend Michael, and we remain friends, that's why I'm here today as a friend, I think it's an incredible achievement. And to have done a building like that in your lifetime, I think it's an extraordinary event. To have done that building when you're 14 years old is even more incredible. That's what's so amazing. I mean, I know because I was 15, and our project looked like a 15-year-old, and so I just think that I'm here for a friend. I'm here to salute architecture and to say I think it's an incredible achievement, and one leave it at that.
Thank you. Michael, I know you want to say as few words as possible, but I think we have to have you tell the story of the competition in terms of it's kind of a myth that I think a couple of people at the table have written about, this mythic story. We have a number of young people in the audience here who maybe are not still 14, but are possibly considering competitions, and I think how this came about and something of how the drawings were actually produced that are in the next room would be very interesting if you could discuss that.
Well, the drawings are the drawings, and you can see them. About drawing in general, I can say that I hope that the exhibition, which I'm so grateful that the archivists who own these drawings and keep them so well, I think that they stand, I hope, as a demonstration against the sort of nemesis that architecture is facing as a consequence of the machine. I do believe that it is Pache, Peter, that the computer cannot produce the kind of architectonic thinking that the drawings that we made engaged in, and the drawings of our competitors engaged in. I feel that this is a sad occurrence, but I think you will see in the drawings, if you look at them, that what we were interested in at the time was to make an architecture which we hoped would carry the imprint of some kind of authenticity. Gerhard and I were in New York at the time, and we were surrounded by architecture of Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue, the debased Miesian architecture of the developers of the time. And we thought that we wanted to somehow make an architecture which would be authentic in terms of the demonstration of how it was built, how it was serviced, and how it would occupy the city and become part of the city. And I like to think that we achieved some of that. There's an elephant in the room, and we all know what it is. And I'd like to get rid of that elephant before it becomes a topic of conversation, because I don't think it should be tonight. I think we should talk about the architecture, not about the politics that surround it as of this moment. The issue is not, as far as we were concerned, to get rid of City Hall, but was always, in our view, to do something with it. As architects, we knew there was not the money to build the building properly, and that we could only give Boston the armature for a civic building which we anticipated naively that would be invested with works of art and would engender interest in changing and embellishing the fabric of the building, which is always all we could put up at the time. That has not happened, but I think it's not too late. So that's how I'd address that issue.
Thank you. It's worth pointing out, some people are shocked when they hear the story that when Queen Elizabeth came to Boston in 1976 for the bicentennial, the first time that a British monarch came to the former colonies, for the special celebration on July 4th, the luncheon in honor of her was held at City Hall. So at that time, in 1976, City Hall was an admired venue which you would bring the Queen of England to. Clearly, as Herb Gleason perhaps has most effectively pointed out over the last several years, having worked in the Kevin White era City Hall, when it was being celebrated, over the past 20, 30 years, the building has not been maintained at the same level, and it has certainly never been developed in terms of the furnishings, the lighting, the signage, the even updating mechanical systems today. But we'll let that go, and I'd like to turn back to the drawings and your comments about those, and think a little bit about imagining a building, because what we're looking at in the next room, if you don't think about the building having been built, these are drawings that mostly produced by two people at night in an architect's office in New York, having to clear out before the staff arrive in the morning to do their work. These drawings essentially lay out the form of a new building. The building that we see there today. One of the topics that I think is interesting is just the variety of drawing types that we see there, and a distinctive one which you don't often see today, which is the section perspective, which Gerhard Kallmann, I believe, was really responsible for using actively. Some other architects at this time used it. The interesting thing for people who are not architects is that we have drawings that are perceptual based on the individual, and a perspective drawing is really set up that way for an individual. It represents what you might see, how a building might look to you. They're drawings that are conceptual, which are abstractions, which are accurately representing the building as it exists, and not necessarily as you see it. A floor plan is that way, a section is that way, an axonometric is that way. And the axonometric, of course, is an object, a building representing, a drawing representing an object building we associate with modernism, and Peter Eisenman certainly has worked in that field, created axonometric models and buildings. And so perhaps we can talk about that, what happened with the section perspectives out there is you have a hybrid drawing that actually represents the abstraction of a section, the conceptual drawing of a section, and then represents the space at the same time as a perspective. And it was a unique drawing style, seems to have been common for certain architects at that time. And I think you have to think about how it affects imagining a building. And I wonder, Michael, if you might say something about that, and I don't know, Peter, in terms of the discussion of the types of drawings. I think it's very interesting that we don't have axonometrics out in the other room.
Well, Peter should comment on this more than I.
I don't want to get into a discussion of the axonometric versus section perspectives because, you know, everybody to their own desires. You know, some people like red wine, some white wine. I don't think one is better than the other. I think for the building that Michael and Gary were doing, the kinds of drawings they made were appropriate. I think doing axonometrics of that particular building, that toughness, that for me, the material presence of the building still today, I think those drawings accurately portray what they wanted to get and what they did get. So, first of all, I think those drawings, the idea of the section perspective comes out of London at a certain moment, whether it was the AA or the Regent Street or whatever. I know that John Fowler, one of Michael and my roommates, used to also use them and did them for Paul Rudolph, the graduate student housing project that John worked on for Paul. He did the sort of section perspective. So I don't think Gary or Michael or John or anybody, it was a type of drawing probably coming out of the brutalist movement at the time in London, let's say in the late 50s, mid-50s. I think it accurately describes the building as it was to be. In other words, the idea of a materiality, of a placed building. I mean, it was not to be a kind of, it was a transition between high modernism and postmodernism. It was something other than, and I think, have no argument with me. I couldn't draw like that. That's the only reason we didn't make drawings like that. You know, and I used to sit for hours, Michael knows, you know, with my, what was that pen that used to go like that, Michael?
The Graphos.
That was Graphos. Oh my God. Filling Graphos pens and, you know, so the line weight was the same. I mean, there was no such thing as Pantone and Hatch and things. We'd draw the whole thing. Whether it was an axonometric or a section perspective, it was still drawing. And that was the big thing. And I think when I see the kids in my office connecting dots on a computer, you cannot make an architectural plan by connecting dots. Whether it's drawing that does it or what is the implication. I think, by the way, something that Michael and Gary had, and which I think is probably more important than necessarily being able to draw, because there are a lot of people that can draw. They draw junk. Michael and Gary had, both of them, a fantastic eye. And I think that's what animates their drawing. I mean, those guys could see a drawing before it was there, right? Making it is another thing. But to have the eye that those guys had, and that's what I think is missing. Most of the kids today can't have an eye because all they're seeing is dots and connecting things, you know. And now, even with these new things, which the AIA and others are pushing, like BIM and Revit, and you know, they're really the killers. I mean, killers like these things hadn't been invented in Michael's time, but they're a plague out there now. So I'm in the drawing game. I mean, you know, I don't want to hit drawing, because if I could abolish teaching, there's no reason why schools should be teaching BIM and Revit. You can learn it in practice. They ought to be teaching how to see.
You know, they had an eye. No question they had an eye. But they also had a special kind of brain, which is a brain that thinks three-dimensionally. And this is a thing I find so astonishing about those drawings. Most architects, frankly, cannot conceptualize in 3 dimensions volumetrically. They think they can, they say they can. But it's the difference between playing chess, playing 3D chess where you're stacking the boards, but really you're thinking in a very orthogonal fashion. It's very linear. Versus that sort of Star Trek-y 3D chess where it's all in different planes and different directions and you can move it around. And that's what these guys did. I have known very, very few architects who can do that. And even now, with the aid of computer technologies that allow some very interesting work that is certainly far different, you may think that that's what's happening, but in fact it's not. Obviously, there's the being able to the crutch of the machine, but it's also thinking two-dimensionally, or even the famous Frank Gehry thing, crumbling a piece of paper and throwing it down. Very easy to do that and do some kind of topometric representation of that. But to conceive of something three-dimensionally as complex as this building is, and to conceive of it from the inside out, I mean, just think about that, how extraordinary that is. And then how difficult it is to convey that somehow with a two-dimensional medium on paper. I mean, it's a really extraordinary thing.
I'll jump into the breach without condemning the computer or Revit or any of that stuff. What appeals to me about the drawings, right?
You don't mind that I did?
No. But
for the record.
No. What appeals to me about the drawings, I happen to bring one that was the cover of an exhibition. Right? It's not of City Hall, by the way. What appeals to me about the drawings is precisely a combination of precision and imprecision. Yes, they understood three-dimensionally, and so do architects. They were not unique in that side. But the drawing was an act of discovery. It was precise, and yet it was in the process of evolving further. That's what was amazing about those drawings. The combination of precision and a bit of indecision about what some things were, especially the hand drawings. And you understood that this was about, you looked at a drawing as a piece of process as opposed to a finite description of something. And I think that that's maybe a little bit lost when one does work with computers as opposed to by hand. And you know, we missed that a little bit, but I'm not going to sort of defile all modern architecture forever on because they couldn't draw as well. But it is precise and not precise. And so it was an act of discovery. And that's what was appealing to me about them.
I had written down a few things that Michael had said at one time or another. Michael was my thesis advisor back in the 1960s, although he was only about a year and a half older than I was, but he was able to assert a kind of authority. And we've known each other ever since then, and would it be fair to say we collaborated on a project that won the prize for the best thesis that year? But he said something that I wrote down, and I was just going to repeat it. Talking about architecture, he used the phrase, a dialogue between order and incident. I think that's something you're talking about, too. There's the order, but there's the variation within the order. I remember my old boss, Jose Luis Sert, saying once, you have to have a system and you have to break it. And I think that's true. And I'm a kind of literary type, and I was comparing that with something that Robert Frost used to say about laying the rhythm of speech across the rhythm of the beat of the poem. I think that's very much the same kind of thing.
I wonder if just ask one question kind of about that thesis experience. There was a description by Edward Seckler from when he was at Harvard about how the two of you, Michael, always had a pen or pencil in your hand, and it demonstrated for him the fact that architectural thinking was visual thinking. And I'm just wondering if you might share with us what the nature of a review might have been, just to touch momentarily on that process, if you were designing your thesis and Michael is your critic.
It's a long story, and it's certainly going to get me in trouble. Michael did not draw, that I recall, no, during crits. He's very articulate verbally, as I'm sure you know, not only with a pencil, but with words and language. And he was very demanding. He seemed to think I was better than I thought I was. And I think he drew me to a level I wouldn't have been at before, which is exactly what an advisor ought to do. The second thing I would say about him, which is a little bit funnier, is he had too many ideas. And for a student, he could overwhelm you with sort of bright ideas in a session. And you had to learn how to edit him. And at least that was my feeling. I'm not able to see the expression on his face. And I often wondered whether Gerhard Kallmann had a similar role, that maybe Michael generated a lot of ideas and Gerhard had this sort of philosophical framework to a greater degree. I don't know that. I'm just guessing.
I'd like to just comment on the discussion. I think the discussion and the evening should not be about me. I think it should be about the building. It is, in fact, as we all know, as I know better than anybody, a deeply flawed building. There's no question about that. How could it be otherwise? Prepared as the competition was by neophyte architects, my partner had never built a building in his life up until that point, and I certainly hadn't.
Thing, because I had just gotten back from military service in Korea. When I went to work, I worked up here for the Architects Collaborative, and I went down to Columbia, and I was absolutely enthralled with the Katsura Palace and the Japanese tea house, etc. So when I was asked to do a fraternity house at Cornell, also a neophyte, the only thing I could think of was to do a Japanese tea house. I mean, that really wasn't going to be my style. But in any case, I was rooming with these two Brits, and they said, they took a look at this thing, and they said, "You can't do that." And they took this house and completely changed it into an English brutalist fantasy, right? Which had not much to do with the City Hall, Michael, to be honest. I mean, whatever you guys were doing. Thank God it never got built. But I think that Michael and John were much under the influence of people like Sterling and even, I mean, clearly echoes of Le Corbusier, things we didn't know in the United States, certainly, and Michael and I were talking about this before. I grew up a lot being in England for 3 years and under the influence of, while Michael had Gerhard as a colleague, I had Colin Rowe, who was a very different English mentor. And my work changed radically by the kinds of things that I saw. And I wrote a book on Giuseppe Terragni, who I'd never even heard of when I was in graduate school at Columbia. So was the Boston City Hall more of an influence on me than Terragni or Moretti, as we were talking about, or any number of architects? I would say much more, if you look at my early work, was much more under the influence of somebody like Terragni. Maybe, I don't know if I was running away from the City Hall. I mean, I know I was running away from Lou Kahn, that's for sure. And I found that a problematic influence, as I did also the Venturi rendition of Native America. Michael, it's something we could explore, but I'm not convinced that my 3 years in England hadn't turned me in another direction. You could say something about that if you want.
Okay, we should try to use the mics, okay?
I thought I was.
Maybe you were just jealous, that's all, as you said earlier. Maybe that's what it was. I'm a couple of years younger than these two, although probably older than you. I was a student at Cornell studying with Colin Rowe, and we took a trip to Boston to see City Hall, and it certainly provoked me and my classmates. It certainly provoked me. I can't say exactly how it influenced my design work, but the power of it, the kind of monumentality of it, the harshness of it, the way in which it kind of sat in and dominated the landscape, I just found astonishing. And we stood there kind of, I'm sorry to say, it's kind of jaws agape, staring up inside of the main entrance for quite a while. And it certainly seemed full of possibilities that hadn't been kind of imagined in my work before, or actually in what I was seeing being drawn among my classmates at Cornell. So certainly, and I still feel that way, by the way, whenever I enter the building. The sheer kind of audacity of it, not just on the outside, but actually as you enter it, and you encounter this amazing constellation of space and volume and concrete. It's astonishing. And it's that astonishment that made you just aspire a bit differently about your own work and the possibilities of modern architecture than prior to seeing it, especially for the first time. I'm not sure that's the provocation that you expected, but it certainly was a provocation.
Well, I think what I was referring to was that I'm
It's on.
flattered, of course. No, it's not. It's
Here, this one works.
This one works, yes. I'm flattered by these. I'm flattered by these comments, but I think this is missing the point that I'm trying to make. There was a reaction to this building in architectural circles, at an intellectual level. There was, first of all, it was reviled, both the building and the government centre, by Jane Jacobs. There was an extreme reaction to it. There was an extreme reaction on the part of Mr. Venturi and his wife, who really then produced a cartoon that said a dumb building, and had "I am a city hall" written on it. There was a very, I think, a reaction also, I think, Peter, in the degree to which, through largely your influence in the Institute in New York, a kind of, I don't want to say intellectual, but I want to say more abstract interest in architecture and the way architecture should be made. I like to think that the provocation was there in these reactions, as well as in the that of the cab driver who said, "Well, it's really an Aztec filling station." I mean,
Mike, could you
Yeah. It's the first time I've ever been linked with Bob Venturi and his wife and Jane Jacobs, number one. So I, in fact, ran into a group of students who came to my office yesterday and saying, well, wasn't Jane Jacobs a hero? And I had tried to explain why I didn't think Jane Jacobs was a hero. So Bob Venturi and Denise have never been heroes in my book, so we can't do that. To think that our...
Denise is at the GSD right now giving a talk. I hope not about you.
I wouldn't have thought so. I remember one of my great faux pas in life was a conference at the GSD. It cost me dearly, by the way, where Michael Graves, Peter Eisenman, Caesar Pelli, and Bob Venturi were supposed to be speaking, representing certain opposite poles of the world. And Denise showed up, and I said publicly in the feminist movement in our history, I wish Bob would stop sending a surrogate. It wasn't a good thing to do, but I admit to all those who remember those moments. Michael, you know, we went different ways, and your career was a different career than my career. To say that it was provoked by the Boston City Hall, I think the Boston City Hall is a fantastic building, as I've said, and I will continue to say it. I don't think that it provoked me any more than going to see the work of Palladio or going to see the work of Le Corbusier, which I had never seen, or seeing Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor and all of the things that I took in the 3 years that I was in England. And you know that our way of thinking about the world, how we framed the world, was different. I don't think, hey, buddy, you begin to give me credit for something I don't have, right? And I don't think I was a big influence on the world at all. I would honestly say that. Do you?
I'd be interested in terms of provoking, maybe exploring a little bit what might have provoked the designs for City Hall itself. One of the intriguing aspects of the criticism of the building at the time, I don't mean negative criticism, but they're negative as well as positive, was that you found some people who simply said, this is La Tourette, you know, and that's it. They dismiss it as being Le Corbusier, and there's a famous two-page spread, speaking of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, where they essentially chart the brutalist style from La Tourette to Boston City Hall to Neiman Marcus, and kind of the distribution of brutalism around the world. Clearly, that was an inspiration. Le Corbusier was an inspiration, provocation perhaps, but then you certainly have references to the Aztec design, to comparisons were made to ancient Greece in terms of the upper levels of City Hall, reading as sort of an abstracted entablature, and a very rich variety of perhaps sources of inspiration, perhaps references, which in later work would become even more widespread. And Robert, I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit about themes that you have identified in City Hall, but also in later work of Kallmann, McKinnell, and Wood, and references that it may have been encompassing.
Is this on? I think we should talk more about City Hall than we have been. First of all, I would say I am an admirer of Jane Jacobs, and I don't know that she commented on City Hall, but she certainly commented on the quality of urban design planning in Boston at that time, and it was disastrous. And the plaza in front of City Hall is an extremely bad piece of urban planning, and nobody's ever figured out a way to deal with it because of conditions that are too complicated to go into. But there is if you take the whole government center renewal project as a whole, and compare it to the kinds of busy city streets that existed there before, I would prefer what we had before, and I'm sure Jane Jacobs would have been right and would have said it would have pulled itself up by its bootstraps. It would have renovated itself the same way other neighborhoods do. But I wanted to talk about City Hall just a little bit. I'm the person on the panel that probably has the most contact with the general public. You're not the general public. The general public despises, hates, loathes Boston City Hall. And I was mentioning it to a guy, an editor at the Globe just recently, who's a newcomer there, and we talked about City Hall, and he said, I said all the things that I liked about it, and he said, yeah, but it's still an eyesore. And I was going to talk about that because these comments never end. Tastes are tastes. What's wrong with ugly? That's my question. What's wrong with ugly? If you have an ugly uncle, do you want to murder him? If you have an ugly first spouse, you know, come on. The Alps were thought to be very ugly until the 18th century because they were just places where you got killed by the weather and trying to cross them. Not until they became a kind of recreational and the kind of a romantic movement began and talked about vistas and landscapes and things. Did anybody, there is no written record of anyone's having said an Alp was beautiful before that. I used to divide when I first got interested in architecture. There were three kinds of American architecture: early American, ugly Victorian, and sterile modern. And ugly Victorian, when I am old enough to remember when Victorian was considered to be ugly. It's now very much in vogue. Charles Eliot Norton, the great scholar at Harvard in the 19th century, said, "Study the system of ornamentation of Seaver Hall. It is more than babyish. Why should Austin Hall be built as if to resist a siege?" In other words, somebody's saying the building, many people would say today, that Seaver Hall is the greatest work of architecture in Greater Boston. Certainly Austin Hall by Richardson, also by Richardson, is very highly thought of. Other people dismissed Harvard Yard as a collection of red brick boxes that looked more like a farm than an institution of higher learning. Red brick became so unpopular that, as many of you know, I'm sure they painted the State House the color of what's the word I'm looking for? Stone. What? Limestone. I've reached the age when one word disappears out of every sentence. And that was done to the State House and also to Faneuil Hall. They were painted yellow because brick was so cheap and ugly. I think there are a lot of influences in Boston City Hall, and I think you can tell a lot of stories about it, and I think that's one of the things that makes it beautiful. I was shocked when I gave a talk to another forum about City Hall 3 or 4 years ago. I looked up the plan, and I had heard that Gerhard was interested in Mycenaean architecture, the sort of early Greek architecture, and I looked up the plan of Knossos, and they're very, very similar, and so the plan of the American Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Cambridge, which I was very much involved in. All three of them have essentially the same ground floor plan, a roughly square, geometrically squared off, you know, right angles and all, courtyard or open to the air or not open to the air in the middle. And then as they move out to the edge from that, they begin to break down more and more as they begin to respond to the circumstances of the context around them. So it's an idea that one follows through a certain amount of their work. And I think the idea of the architecture as a ruin is something else. Gerhard used to say, I know, that the beauty of the building will be that it will always be a lovely ruin and that everybody will have a terrible time tearing it down. Maybe we'll find that out. I just want to give some comments about my own feeling about it. There's the sense of an unfinished building, which Michael mentioned, a building that is alive in time, that has a past, that has a future, living and changing as its uses, its context, and its program change. I think all those things should be changed. I think it should be like the great monuments in Rome, subject to addition and subtraction and change of use all the time, and I think it would work very well. There are younger architects, a couple of whom I've spotted here, who believe in what they call heroic architecture. Not everybody hates Boston City Hall, and younger architects means about 40, I guess, am I right? They love it. And there's a generational thing here, too, isn't there? One generation loves a certain popular singer, and the next generation puts that whole period down, and then the next generation revives it. And we're now in the beginning of the revival stage of heroic architecture, or brutalism. It's unfortunate the name brutalism came along. But you'll forgive me, I'm going to read a paragraph that I wrote years ago that I liked, a story about Boston City Hall. Won't take but a minute or two. Let me find it here, yeah. Hope I won't embarrass Michael. This is a fantasy. Once upon a time, there was a great palace. Its walls sparkled with precious mosaics and gold leaf and were hung with dramatic paintings and tapestries. Its great halls were filled with torchlight and music and ceremony, with princes and minstrels and clowns. But then came a time of troubles. Barbarians invaded. The palace was shelled. Great chunks were blasted away. You realize, of course, I'm talking about City Hall. Vandals stripped the ornament. Afterward, the surviving people of the kingdom, using the rubble of war, built their brick huts in the shelter of the ruined old palace. That's Boston City Hall, wounded and gutted, but still trumpeting. It's a kind of elephant at bay. Few have called it user-friendly. I think that we have reached a time in our culture when tearing things down is a bad idea almost always. There's a great deal of energy embedded in City Hall. It would take a great deal of energy to tear it down. It would take a great deal of energy to build a new one. Do we really want to do that? That's another argument. But the real argument is, I think, here is something so remarkable that if you love it or hate it, I don't care, you care about it. And I think that's a great achievement.
What I want to give a like story in New York. When I was starting out in architecture, they were building Frank Lloyd Wright's museum on Fifth Avenue, and all of the neighbors, to a person, were against the building. They said they're going to destroy the avenue, they're going to do this or that. And all the voices of reaction that wanted to keep Fifth Avenue the way it was were against the museum. But it finally got built, violating all kinds of zoning ordinances that had been in place at the time. My friend Charles Gwathmey was then asked to make an addition to Wright's museum. And the very same people that objected to the museum in the first place objected violently to anybody touching and changing their precious object. So there is a kind of fickle nature to listening to these voices, I think. I mean, just because there are a lot of people that hate Boston City Hall, are we supposed to, listen to these voices? There are a lot of people that hate President Obama, from what I gather. Not in Massachusetts necessarily, but, around the country. So I'm surprised that you bring up these voices, Bob, because I honestly, Michael shouldn't care. It's a great work, and it will survive the test of time. All great works do, as Wright's Museum did. And, if we're saying that it made a disturbance, it certainly has made a disturbance throughout its time in being. I mean, it is certainly disturbing, from what I can gather, to people today, as Wright's Museum was disturbing. But things change.
I just add to that. One difference, though, is the museum's mission is generally the same. Obviously, museums have morphed over time, but the institutional mission is essentially the same. Government has changed a lot. Our attitudes about government has changed a lot, and we need to separate politics from government. This was a building whose big idea was about government and not about politics, and now it's become about politics. But the way our relationship to our government has changed, and the tools of government have changed. The needs of the neighborhoods, the city has changed. The need to perhaps make the government more responsive within the neighborhoods. There are lots of different models now for government that would have made a new city hall now fundamentally different from the building we have now. What is extraordinary about this building is that it is, in fact, what Michael has called an armature. You could be very cynical and say, well, he's just saying that now, but there is an aspect of this building that does accommodate change from within. You can do a lot to this building. You can poke it, you can punch it, you can add on, you can pull stuff out, and the essential character and nature and spirit of the building will still endure. About 5 years ago, Architecture Boston did a whole issue and the last time someone wanted to tear it down, Mayor Menino, devoted to reimagining City Hall, and we invited 6 young teams of young architects to address what we listed out as all the sins of the building, all the things that you know that are wrong with it. And it was a wonderful exercise. It was very interesting actually to see some constants. The notion of maybe punching through on the plaza level so that you can see through was one of them. Punching through on the Congress Street facade was another one. It is an inherently generous building in that regard. It can accommodate change. It should accommodate change. Michael is the first one to say so. And I think that is something that we should now start to think about, a way of making this building respond in all the ways that we've talked about, of making it better, making it more humane, better lighting, all those things that we know about, but also making it work for a change in the way we dance with our government.
Well,
I just wanted to comment a little bit on what Peter said, since I do deal with the general public. If you have the opportunity to make a building that people love as opposed to a building that people hate, that's the better thing to do. The City Hall is an exception in that regard, and I think something we're not talking about. I remember years ago I was sitting at dinner next to a guy who turned out to be the president of Northeastern, and he said, we have all these ugly white buildings, you know, it's just terrible. What should we do about it to make it interesting? And I said, you don't have an architectural problem, you have a landscape problem. And I think he must have heard that from other people, because that's what they did. The place was paved in black asphalt. The buildings were white cubes on top of it. It couldn't have looked more hideous. You walk through there today and those buildings are just fine. I think City Hall needs a better setting. I think the setting of City Hall Plaza is inadequate. I would like to see, if it were possible, to see City Hall Plaza ringed with an inner ring of buildings that would make the plaza smaller and would make the street that now arcs around the plaza a two-sided street, and therefore a much more successful street. I mean, a lot of things could be done. Some things are very obvious, like taking the atrium in the middle of City Hall that's open to the sky and glazing it in and making it a winter garden. It would be great if we could hire the gentleman three places over from me to do all these things.
first of all, I think that, you know, the public hates lots of buildings. Wow. Imagine how hard it is to make City Hall work if we can't get 5 microphones to work. Right. First of all, I think that it's exaggerated how much this building's reviled. It's become fashionable to say that. And it's kind of, you know, and I wish we would get off that subject, frankly. Now, where I do agree with Bob is I think that it is unfortunate that it's so open in its space that it seems to be somehow floating free of today of the context. And I think that's part of the reason why it appears so harsh. So, and as you know, I spent 7 years trying to fix City Hall to no avail. One of the most beautiful moments I think about the building is as you come out of the subway stop and you're walking towards Faneuil Hall and the upper parts of City Hall cup over Faneuil Hall. It's an incredible moment and one of the best pictures ever of City Hall, the way in which the new somehow embraces and points to the old. There was Peter Vanderwalker's in the audience there. At some point, he made a wonderful collage, which I use in my talks very often. He sort of kept Scully Square. He just kept Scully Square, but still put City Hall in there. I think that would have been amazing. It's a wonderful image. Pardon? History rules. Yeah, no. The point is, I think that it is easy enough when you put a huge, you know, pile of concrete and set it off against a very large open space, which is more reviled than the building, it seems to me. That it's kind of there to point to, right? Now, you know, probably a very important moment at which to try to do that. But if the building was actually seen in the way that it's seen in its parts, and the way it actually, in a subtle way, responds to its kind of context, like the way it addresses Faneuil Hall, I think we would not revile it as much. But frankly, I think it's becoming fashionable just to say I hate it. And by the way, it's not going to be demolished. You heard it here first. It'll take. Gerhardt was right. It would take too much effort to demolish it, and it's not going to happen, right? And it shouldn't. It'll never happen. It'll never happen. So we should not even worry about that. But I wish the people would not make a joke out of something that actually is. Let them spend more time on other issues. But I think two things that I want to underscore. First of all, I think the plaza needs to adjust to modern times and the way people use plazas, and that will infinitely help City Hall itself. And secondly, your point, I think that there's been an almost a vicious attempt not to maintain it, so as to continue to make the point about how dysfunctional it is, and that's really sad.
Yeah, we need to wrap this up and have a short time for some questions from the audience. But before we do that, I think I might just ask if anybody else has another comment to make before we turn to the audience. No?
Well, I would like to tell just hold it closer. An anecdote, which is not apocryphal. Which is not apocryphal, and it's about ugly. Shortly after we won the competition, Gerhard and I were walking down Madison Avenue, and from the office that we did the drawings in, and approaching us was, I can say, Gerhard's friend, Philip Johnson. And from more than a block away, he was waving his arms at us. And as he approached, he said, "Oh, I'm so happy for you boys. It's wonderful that you've won that competition. It's absolutely marvelous. And it's so ugly."
All right. On that note, any questions?
Yeah. You got it? Okay.
Thanks very much. One thing that strikes me after this panel is the future. Michael talked about embellishment, acknowledging that there were problems. Elizabeth ventured forth, almost like summarizing what was displayed 4 or 5 years ago. I think it is absolutely incumbent upon us, and I guess by us I mean the BSA, to now, especially with a new mayor coming in, to seize this opportunity to really focus on City Hall and on the restitution or maybe the new imposition of embellishment, and make it what Michael and Gerhard and everyone else had initially conceived of. But rather than using this as a one-off, we had a panel, everybody will feel good and go home. What, in terms of policy and in terms of action, does the BSA do now to at least start to go in more deeply into some of the comments that were raised today? And as I said, especially with the new mayor coming in, and based on what I've heard from the two candidates, and even if you discount what they're saying by 20%, there is a real interest in the overview of art in, and I consider this, of course, to be a piece of that, of art in the city, in Greater Boston. What do we do about this?
Thank you. I would hope that various committees at the BSA may be able to address this. It's a good idea. Questions?
It may be, is this working? It may be that the very worst thing that you can do for the preservation of the City Hall is to get a lot of architects to want to keep it.
I don't necessarily mean only architects.
Sir?
Thanks very much for a great panel, and thanks to Lorna and Ken for a terrific presentation. One thing I wanted to, if I could just bring us back quickly to what was said at the outset, which I think was very interesting and very insightful. And I think of all the things that have been said about this building, one thing occurred to me in light of those comments, which was a word that we haven't used to describe the building, but I think is appropriate in viewing it, particularly in the drawings, but today, is resiliency or resilient. And I think perhaps it's worth considering that for a city in crisis, that such a building is exactly appropriate. That is to say, when we think about a building that looks by its nature very strong, powerful, resilient, in the context of a bank, for example, that vocabulary is kind of obvious, but perhaps less so for a civic building. But in this context, maybe again quite appropriate, and perhaps some of the criticism that's been leveled against the building historically does not quite have that appreciation. And I wonder, I'm also struck by your wonderful drawing that's on the cover of the program, which is an elevation that is seen from the street level, from the corner, which accentuates, in effect, the monumental characteristics of the building. It looks both tall and strong, like it's not going anywhere. And again, I wonder if I could just hear your thoughts about that. Does that make sense in light of what you talked about at the outset?
I'd like to say something, and here I will get a little passionate. This was designed in 1962. I remember in New York with your brother at a gathering on 96th Street or somewhere of John F. Kennedy. We at that time believed in the power of government to do good, and we believed that deserved a monument. I heard the other night on television a developer who was saying, well, we should get rid of the building. Boston should capitalize on the marvelous piece of ground it has, build more office buildings. And the questioner said, well, what would happen to the people who work there? We'd have to find a place. He said, there's no problem about that. There's plenty of office space that's available. So what he was actually saying, there's plenty of second-class office space available. I want to build a first-class office building there to rent it out to hedge fund people. Well, there's the difference between what we believed in 1962, that all the aspects which I'm so grateful to Alex describing about the building, we thought that those attributes of the building, those monumental attributes of the building, were appropriate for a place for government to conduct its business. That a worker working for the city should not be going into an ordinary office building. It should be something special, that the visitor who's conducting business and the interface with government should go into a monumental building. That this was the tradition of government always, and the fact that it's democratic government now rather than autocratic government who built monuments makes no difference in my view. That there is a place for monumentality in the urban fabric, and I think that I can't think of a better institution than government to sponsor that.
I think on that note, we're going to have to wrap it up. The exhibit will be open for about another 15 minutes. Thank you all for coming.